Good evening. Good evening. Oh, I'm glad you all are here tonight. My name is Ben Wayman. I'm the Andrews Chair for Christian Unity here at Greenville University. And I'd like to welcome you all to the 7th Annual Andrews Lecture in Christian Unity. Through this annual lecture that we've had now for 7 years, we will welcome to our campus tons of the most faithful and compelling Christian voices today. And tonight is no exception. I'm so excited about our guest speaker tonight. I'd like to welcome students and staff and faculty, administration, church people, and guests of the university. It's a gift to come together, united as we are in Christ, to consider what it looks like for us to be faithful in this moment at this time. With all the divisiveness in our country today and in our world, it's truly a witness to Christ for us to show the kind of unity that we have. Christ makes possible a new way for us to live together. And so for us to live into that is a witness to the world. So here at Greenville University, we believe that the diversity of the church is essential for our flourishing. It's not just an add-on kind of thing. It's essential for us to flourish. Each person in this room makes us better, makes us more fully the body of Christ. And coming together humbly and in love, even in our differences, has everything to do with our discipleship and the unity Christ makes possible. I'd like to thank Dr. David Andrews and the members of the Full Salvation Union for endowing a chair in Christian unity here at Greenville University. Since their gift in the fall of 2016, we've been offering educational opportunities for Christian unity that shaped our campus for the better. And it's helped us point to Christ better through guests and lectures like the one this evening. Tonight's lecture is the most prominent piece of our programming for Christian unity. So it's my privilege to introduce you all to Dr. Jonathan Tran. Dr. Tran is Associate Professor of Theology at Baylor University, where he also serves as the Associate Dean of the Honors College. He's the author of Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, which is his most recent book. He's also the contributing editor for Christian Century and co-editor of the American Academy of Religion and Oxford University Press series, Reflection and Theory in the Study of Religion. Dr. Tran is also an alum of Duke Divinity School, which is where I first met him. And to be more specific, I met Dr. Tran on the basketball court at the rec center at Duke. And I learned quite quickly he could not miss from the arc. And I said, this is a guy that needs to be guarded. He still hoops, in fact, and he was very disappointed to hear that I didn't have a pickup game I could have him jump into. And I told him I just stopped playing years ago when I realized I was old. Apparently he's able to skip that deal and keep playing. I later got to know Jonathan as a doctoral student, and he had a handful of classes with me with Stanley Hauerwas, only he was a preceptor in the class. And he regularly deepened the conversation, moved us to more practical implications for what this looks like for our lives together. And I always really appreciated his contributions in the classes. So Dr. Tran is a basketball guy, he's a theologian, he's a husband and a father. And with all of this and more of who he is, he's a disciple of Jesus Christ. Just a few hours ago, Dr. Tran led our Paul's Letters class in a discussion. Yeah, we got some excited voices over there. And our Paul's Letters class, where he helped us think about new creation and the church. And I'm excited to see how he's going to help us kind of continue this thinking in our time together tonight. So, the title of tonight's lecture is Racial Capitalism versus Divine Economy: How Christianity Offers a Better Anti-Racism. So the format for his lecture tonight will be about 30 minutes of lecture, and then we'll get to ask questions right after that. So be ready, have your iPhones out, your notes ready, and we got a mic queued up here in the center, and we are welcome for you to, we're excited to hear what you have to say about it, how you have to engage with what he has to say. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Tran.
Thank you, Professor Wayman, and thank you to the Greenville University community, including President Davis. I've got gotten, because of this book and its rather shocking and surprising success, to travel a bunch of different places in America, a lot of universities like Yale and Stanford. I have to say Greenville is maybe the sweetest place I've been. And that sweetness doesn't blunt the sharpness and the intelligence. The students in the Paul class this afternoon were raising all the right questions and pushing certainly me and my brain to keep up with their brains. But it's combined with a sweetness to this community that I feel is exceedingly rare in higher ed. So I am deeply grateful for being able to be here just for a couple days and being able to see how much American education as the formation of character in goodness, truth, and beauty is alive in your students and your faculty and your staff. So thank you for having me. I was talking, we were talking about I was thinking about what accounts for the sweetness, and I'm pretty sure it's the sports, right? There's something about sports that grounds student life in a way that, say, just academics, I think, doesn't. I myself fancy myself something of a college athlete. That is, I play free basketball on college campuses. Never actually quite good enough to actually be any kind of real athlete. But I just think sports is a huge part of our formation as human beings. I mean, Aristotle thought this from the beginning. As was mentioned in the introduction, I write a bi-monthly series for the Christian Century. My most recent, and maybe my proudest article, is what do I love more, God or basketball? So the answer is surprisingly close. So. But again, thank you for tonight. I thought what I'd do is talk for about 30 minutes about, I'm going to offer an account of racism that I will call the orthodox view of racism, how I think we tend to think, or how we tend to want to think about what racism is. I'm going to then offer what I think is a more accurate, less convenient picture of racism. The first one will be called orthodox racism. The second will be called racial capitalism. Along the way, I'm going to say a couple things about theological method, that is, how Christians ought to talk about God. This has to do with the state of the university in America. And then I'm going to offer a caveat. And then we'll get to the most important part of the evening, which is conversation as a group. So again, thankful to be here with you all. So let me begin with a caveat. The book is called Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism. Asian Americans feature largely in this book. The caveat is that they won't feature largely in this talk, though I certainly hope there will be questions and conversation about this. But it is precisely through my experience of being Asian American that the ideas of this book came together. And not exactly the experiences of, say, the ongoing racism I experienced as a child. Rather, the realities within anti-racism. I came to America at the end of 3 subsequent wars that America had with Asian countries, Japan, Korea, and in my family's case, Vietnam. So after 3 decades of killing and being killed by Asian and Asian-looking people, I came to a place that saw me as perilous, as dangerous, as not simply foreign or alien, but problematic one. And so I received, as you can imagine, the brunt of a racism that was not simply, at that time in American life, right? It was a racism that wasn't simply acceptable, it was expectable. I could walk out on the street and expect people to call me words, ugly words like chink or nip or goop. That was just part of the story of being American. And that was, for me, a daily reality. You can imagine my surprise then when I finally got to university and we took classes in racism and learned about anti-racism. I was surprised to find out how much I didn't count. How much the experiences of my racism, the racism I'd experienced, simply didn't matter. And it wasn't to say that the story of, say, the deep ways in which the blood of African Americans or Native peoples is deep in the soil of this country, but it was a way that we as Americans told those stories in ways that crowded out people who had suffered other kinds of things. And so I had the experience of being marginalized first by racism and then marginalized by anti-racism. I quickly learned as a university citizen that when people talked about diversity, they didn't really mean me. I didn't count for our numbers. I wasn't part of the recruitment effort. All the while, in a place like Waco, Texas, my kids are literally the only Asian kids in their own entire schools. And yet, somehow, it did not matter. It did not register. It did not count. What I try to do in this book, and hence this caveat, is I try to imagine how I took those experiences of pain and transformed them into power. That is, I try to imagine the kinds of perceptual advantages gained from being in the margins, being at the margins. What could you see about American race and racism from the outside of it, from a person who is kicked out or pushed out or shouldered out of the primary conversation around race and racism? And if you want to see a strong sense of this, think about how during COVID, during BLM 2, Black Lives Matter 2, right, around all the stuff around George Floyd, think about that in relationship to the relative onslaught of anti-Asian violence that occurred during COVID, and how these conversations were parallel but entirely separate conversations, as if one was about racism and the other couldn't be. That, for Asian Americans, tells the entire story of our life in America, marginalized first by racism, and then marginalized by the conversation and practices and imagination of anti-racism. I wanted to imagine Asian Americans as a conceptual miner's canary in the American conversation about race and racism. That the fate of the Asian American, the status in that conversation, what could illuminate about the broader conversation? And that's how this book came to be. And I can say a fair amount more about that, and I hope that that comes up in the conversation. That's the caveat. I'll offer one statement about theological method now, and then I'll come back to a second one later while getting into the two pictures of racism. The first statement about method is that Christianity is an incarnational faith. That the central doctrine, and maybe the most determinative doctrine within our faith, is the doctrine of the incarnation. And as you all know, the incarnation says that God is fully man, God in Christ is fully man and fully divine. Fully God, fully human. That when we see Jesus, we see God in God's totality. That there's no loss in translation when we see Christ on earth in terms of what we see God in God's self. But this doctrine cuts both ways. This doctrine doesn't simply say what God is, it also tells us what God is not. If your life looks something like Jesus, then you have a share in the divine. If your life doesn't, it doesn't. This doctrine cuts both ways. Either the New Testament church, that is Christians today, are going to show up as they did, enabled by the Spirit in the New Testament. We're either going to look like that, or we have very little claim on the God who came in Jesus Christ. The doctrine cuts both ways. Christianity allows very little room for abstraction. We are either going to live a certain way and prove through our lives that the God attested to in Scripture exists, or in our unfaithfulness, we are going to give witness to the world that perhaps that God does not exist. I was raised, as I was talking to the class today, I was raised non-Christian. And so what that means for me, and for those of you that are in this room that were raised non-Christian, my brain is hardwired to not believe in God. That means when I look at the world, it's an effort to make it seem like God exists in this world. What that means for me and other Christians like me is I'm constantly searching for reasons to believe, constantly looking for those available lights that illumine a path that suggests God is part of this world, even though there are witnesses always to the contrary that perhaps God isn't. And to me, the most singular evidence that God exists, the articulation of the incarnation in the body, the gathered body of Christ, is in the faithfulness of Christianity. Such that, and this is how the doctrine cuts both ways, such that if there is not a faithful witness, it raises the possibility that the God we talk about simply does not exist. That's a statement about method. Okay, so let me offer competing accounts of racism. The first one I will call the orthodox view of racism, because this is what most people in America believe about racism. Whether they say it explicitly or implicitly, this is what most people believe racism is and does. I'll follow that then with an account of racism through what the black radical tradition has called racial capitalism. And this other view is meant to correct the first one. I'll say the reason the other one, the racial capitalist account, though more accurate, the reason it is not believed, even though more accurate, is because it is far less convenient. The orthodox view is orthodox precisely because it is a view we want to believe. So what is the orthodox view? The orthodox view imagined racism as primarily an individual affair, primarily a mental affair, primarily a personal affair. Racism is something that begins with me as an individual. It begins with, say, the possession of bad beliefs about other, incorrect, inaccurate descriptions of other people. I look at some Asian people and I think X about them. I run into some black people in the street and I'm possessed of these incorrect viewpoints about them. I see brown people in my neighborhood and I'm overridden. My mind is overridden by stereotypes that then lead to discrimination. It is first an individual affair, something that happens between my, say, ears or maybe in my heart, and then only after it is individual, mental, cognitive, psychological, personal, only then does it go somewhere. In the orthodox account of racism, it always begins with the person, and only secondarily, if that, becomes systemic, structural, or institutional. But even when it becomes structural, systemic, or institutional, our remedy to it is to correct the individual. Right? So again, in the orthodox view, it is first individual and personal, and then sometimes rises to the level of institutions, structures, and systems. Let me give you an example, a material example of how orthodox race people think about the world. We've all heard the example of redlining. Right? Redlining is a practice common or is thought to be common in, say, real estate markets, where people live, who buys houses, these kinds of things. The idea with redlining, according to the orthodox view, I'll give you a competing view in a second, but the view of redlining in the orthodox view is you have a racist mortgage worker. She's over there in her desk. She's getting loan applications, and she's a redliner. She's got a literal red pen, and she's redlining out people with what? African-American sounding names, redlining neighborhoods in Greenville or around Greenville, in Waco, around Waco, and they're saying, black people belong over here, brown people belong over there, and only white people get to live here. Or in some cases, redlining the specific individual. So the problem here is you have the bad actor. And the problem is the bad actor has access to institutions. Namely, she works in a mortgage company and with her red pen can determine how society goes insofar she redlines this or redlines that. Right? The problem is her. And if the problem is her, then the remedy, the mode that anti-racism should take within the Orthodox view, of course, is to correct her thinking, to identify her, to educate her. And how do we do so? Well, how have we done so for the last 20, 30 years in American corporate culture? We put on a diversity training. The diversity training has the benefit of, say, at that mortgage company, educating her that Asian people are not X. That while you may think Asian people are X, they're rather like Y. Right? It's educating the mortgage worker not to think that black people can't be with white people, that brown people aren't all whatever. Again, the idea is that the racism sits in the individual, and if you want to correct and counter the racism, you correct and counter the individual. And that's what the billion-dollar enterprise of diversity trainings are meant to do, whether they be in Fortune 500 companies or whether they be American universities and colleges. Find the individual, find the bad actor, educate them, and if you cannot educate them, cast them to the side of polite society. Let me give you another example of orthodox race thinking. What racism is according to the orthodox definition. In this account, you can explain something like the enterprise of American chattel slavery, which unfolded over hundreds of years at the origins of this country's life. You can explain it as largely a kind of individual metaphysical mistake. That is, white people made the mistake of thinking black people were not fully human. And in thinking them not fully human, in making that metaphysical mistake, they mistakenly enslaved them. They mistakenly built an economy around them. Right? That's the full expression of the mindset of the Orthodox view. That something like American chattel slavery, the enslavement of human beings over hundreds of years in a system of chattel, that is, you didn't simply own the person, but you owned the person's children and their children, that rested on a metaphysical mistake. And thank God, hundreds of years later, we've become civilized and realized black people, in fact, are human beings. That's the Orthodox view. The view that issues from the black radical tradition, often referred to as black Marxism, has the entirely opposite view. In this view, race and racism are not an individual affair that sometimes rises to the level of system structures and institutions. Rather, racism is always structural. It is always systemic. It is always institutional. The way it gets to individuals is that individuals are habituated within these institutions, systems, and structures to think racist thoughts. And why? Because the racist thoughts do work. One of the most demanding ethical questions of our time is this one. If it is almost universally agreed upon within contemporary modern society that racism is bad, that it is a moral evil, that it is destructive, if it is almost universally agreed upon at this point that those things are true, then why does racism persist? The answer is as chilling as it is true. Racism persists because racism works. Racism facilitates an entire world, an entire society. It is the engine that makes our lives, or at least most of our lives, possible. What's the racial capitalist description, account of how racism works? If it's not the individual sometimes rising to the level of systems such that to correct it is simply to issue so many diversity trainings, then what is it? Racism in the racial capitalist account works rather like this. I'm driving around my city, Waco, Texas. You can imagine the same thing in the suburbs of greater St. Louis. Driving around Waco, Texas, I go to East Waco, a historically black community. All the houses there, or most of them, are in ill repair. There is very little infrastructure. There are no banks, there are no medical centers, there's very little education. Constantly, year after year, the taxing codes almost ensure perpetual, not simply lack of education, but perpetual what sociologists call school-to-prison pipelines. And this is not simply a reality of this generation, but a perpetual generational issue year in and year out. I drive over to southwest Waco. Beautiful suburbs. Plenty of access to education, to healthcare, plenty of access to employment. In fact, those things are presumed. They are never up for question. I notice that with all that infrastructure, there's a coincidence. Everyone there happens to be white. Racial capitalism works by cultivating in my imagination, in my mind, the diseased form of thinking that thinks that race explains those realities. Racism is a form of justification that legitimizes, justifies, institutionalizes, and facilitates breathtaking forms of inequality. I go to East Waco and I say, rather than saying something like, how have we organized our society that it looks like this? And I go to Southwest Waco and I say, why are all the white people the ones with access to education and healthcare? Instead of asking that question, race tempts me to do this. Oh, I see what's going on here. They're black. It's on them, right? It's natural to who they are. It's essential to them. It's based in their race. Race is the ultimate gaslighting move. It is to blame the oppressed for their oppressions. For the black radical tradition, it was simply saying, of course it's not us. Y'all conjured up a bunch of stuff just to justify this in perpetuity. Just like when I go to Southwest Waco and I say, oh, I know how we explain all this, the access to education and healthcare and employment. It's because they're white. It's natural to them. They, by nature, by essence, by race, deserve these things. And this cultivation, right, not over years, not over decades, over centuries, trains our minds to allow this to go on in perpetuity. Racism persists because racism works. The reason we want to believe the orthodox version is because we can perpetually say, oh, it's them, it's the bad actors, not me. Right? We can get on social media and call out and cancel the racists, all the while washing our hands of our participation and benefiting from that system. Racism persists because racism works. In the racial capitalist account, think now to the two examples. It is not the bad actor mortgage worker who, possessed of her stereotypes, is redlining individuals. That's not what happens, or that only happens after the fact. Rather, long before the redlining happens, you've created an entire infrastructure of housing that is dependent on things like salary and income disparities, zoning based on education and based on taxation, which is almost entirely based on wealth, rental gaps, lack of infrastructure investment on the part of cities, permitting. All these systems collide, right, and contribute and combine and conspire against black and brown life. It doesn't need the redliner. The redliner, in a sense, becomes simply the end of a process that was created over centuries to guarantee that some people will never have access to the kind of housing that most of us take as a matter of course. Think to the second example. According to the Orthodox view, right, American chattel slavery, the chattel enslavement of human persons, was predicated on a metaphysical mistake. White people mistakenly made, right, the categorical mistake of calling black people not humans when in fact they're humans. That's not the tragedy of American chattel slavery. The tragedy of American chattel slavery isn't that we made a metaphysical mistake and thought some who were human were not human. The moral tragedy of American chattel slavery is that we enslaved those who we knew could not fail to be anything but human. That we lived in a system so decrepit, so broken, that we thought it was okay to dehumanize those who we could not fail to know were fully human. That is an inconvenient truth. Much easier to imagine, oh, we made a metaphysical mistake. Now that we've corrected ourselves downstream 200 years, we can correct that mistake. In comes the diversity training. Remember, diversity training, think about where they show up. American corporations and American colleges and universities, both upper middle class, elite parts of our institution. They are the gatekeepers of a capitalist system built on exploitation and domination. Those are the conveniences we furnish ourselves to make ourselves feel better as beneficiaries of that system. In transitioning then to the second half, then let me say a few things and make another comment about theological method. The good news for Christianity is this. We believe that sin, no matter how powerful, how persistent, how functional, how much sin benefits, that sin is a bit player in the larger story of God's victory of justice and mercy. That sin, no matter how systemic, how institutionalized, how much structured into our human life, is secondary to the goodness and justice of God. That is an absolutely critical methodological commitment on the part of Christians if we're to confront the evil that is racial capitalism. If we allow sin to dictate the way the story is told, then we will always subsume ourselves to that story. Only if we have the Christian faith to claim the supremacy of Christ's victory on the cross, then will we have the ability to tell a more hopeful story, in part because a more honest story. One of the hardest parts of writing this book was writing the book in a way that accurately portrayed the American church as the villain it has been in the story of American racism, complicit to its neck in race and racism, telling that story accurately while also telling a story where the church is not simply a villain. How do we tell the story of the church's villainy where it's not simply a villain? Where we tell the story accurately and honestly about the history of racism in the American church in the way it's all up in these systems without letting that be the last word, because we believe that the God who began the church will complete that work and bring it to completion. So in the second half of the book, then, I tell the story after having tried to give an account of racial capitalism in the way that I just described. I try to give an account of a religious community, a Christian community that tries to live differently. So let me describe the community and then conclude by saying some things about its theology. That is how it talks about and sees God. This community is a bunch of students. It was begun by a bunch of students that went to school at Stanford University and Cal Berkeley, two elite institutions in American higher ed. All these kids went there because their families wanted them to go there, because they're able to go there, and because they're on their way to the upper middle class, which is raced in exactly the ways I just described. That is, they were in a process of not simply facilitating upper class movement, but a thoroughly racialized upper middle class movement, that race and class go hand in hand in American society. Fortunately or unfortunately for them, this group of students met Jesus. And in meeting Jesus, they came to realize two things about Jesus. One, that Jesus is on the side of the oppressed, and two, that they want to be with Jesus as much as possible. So upon graduating from Stanford University and Berkeley, and rather than absconding to the upper middle class of Silicon Valley, they took their electrical engineer brains, their computer science brains, a lot of them were trained as teachers, their teacher brains, and rather than ascending to the ranks of the upper middle class, chose to move into, at the invitation of a local black church, into the most marginalized part of San Francisco, what's known as Southwest San Francisco, or often simply referred to as Black San Francisco, the Bayview Hunters Point part of San Francisco. Bayview Hunters Point is the part of San Francisco I'm willing to bet that when you all go and visit San Francisco as tourists, not only do you never go there, you will be warned against going there. It is the site of extraordinary forms of environmental racism. The U.S. government literally decommissioned a nuclear aircraft carrier in this neighborhood because they thought two things. Black people don't matter that much, and they wouldn't complain about it. They unleashed generations of cancer into this neighborhood. But the other thing about Southwest San Francisco, the other thing about Bayview Hunters Point, the other thing about Black San Francisco is that it had been the site of God's enduring witness for almost a century. That while money had parked its place in different parts of San Francisco, made its place in different parts of San Francisco, God, the God of the oppressed, had made his part with Black San Francisco. And so there was a history of church and Christianity unlike anything in the rest of San Francisco. At the invitation of these churches, these Stanford and Cal students, most of whom were Asian American, were invited into this community. And over a course of 2 decades, at the behest of their neighbors, they started a school for the local kids in the neighborhood. On the one hand, they were the first in City Hall agitating for change. But as change didn't happen, and as generation of kids were not being educated, they started a school that was largely for free in the neighborhood. They used their electrical engineering brains as electrical engineers and computer science to create a software company, Dayspring Partners. They used this company to redistribute money in the neighborhood because they believe that local businesses owned by black owners are the backbone of any community. They committed their lives to living life alongside their neighbors, not because they imagined themselves as do-gooders or especially virtuous, but going back to their earlier commitment that God is on the side of the oppressed and God is doing beautiful things on the side of the oppressed, and they wanted to be near beauty. They wanted to be near God. The early church referred to this kind of life as the divine economy. It was one of the first words, as early church scholars know, of what we call the Christian gospel. It was a way of narrating God not giving up on humanity, even though humanity had given God every reason to give up. The divine economy believes that justice and mercy are not something that we need to gird ourselves up by the loins and fight for, right? It's that the primary political key of Christianity isn't resistance, but rather that the primary political key of Christianity is proclamation, that God wins, that justice and mercy are natural to the world, natural to Bayview Hunters Point, because justice and mercy are natural to God. These are people who don't imagine themselves as superheroes living extraordinarily virtuous lives. They rather imagine themselves as rather ordinary and leaning into the victory that was accomplished on a Friday, a Saturday, and a Sunday during which Christ was crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. That the work of anti-racism isn't some extra heroic effort that we need to do in confronting an overpowering power in racial capitalism, but rather the divine economy is simply something we lean into because when Christ said, "It is finished," it is indeed finished. It's the same work I imagine the students in the Paul class today, the students being formed and habituated, having their imaginations radically expanded at Greenville University doing today, at a Baylor University doing today. None of these are the efforts of extra heroic superhuman people. Rather, they are the ordinary people leaning into the liturgy of the church that claims these are the terms of the new world, and this is how we ought to live. So racial capitalism is bad, and it is big, and it is ugly. Certainly bigger and badder than uglier than the convenient orthodox racism that we want to imagine. But more so true than that is the truthfulness and the beauty and the goodness of the Christian gospel, which is an invitation to call time on racial capitalism and offer us fuller lives than that could ever give us. Thank you. I look forward to conversation with you now. I'm happy to hear thoughts, reflections you all have, questions about anything I've said, questions about other things related to these that you're thinking about. I believe we have a microphone in the middle of the sanctuary. I'm a professor, so I'm used to silence. So.
Hello. My question is, what do you think in the church today is kind of the biggest barrier from like living out this divine economy, and how do you think the church can, or even just Christians and like individually, can kind of move beyond these barriers?
The question was, what do I think is the largest barrier to living into the divine economy? Jesus told us 2,000 years ago what that boundary would be. And Jesus talks about himself in the kingdom of God. Second most, he talks about money. Almost no instances of which does he have positive things to say. Of all the things that God could have paired negatively with the kingdom and Christian faithfulness, it was manna. We love money. Christians are addicted to wealth. And in our love for money and our addiction to wealth, we will use any justification necessary to justify lives of comfort and power and wealth. That's the answer. And so that's why we tend to want to think about racism in this personalist, non-structural way, because it absolves our hands, it washes our hands of that reality. So in some sense, the answer hasn't changed for 2,000 years. What is the big detriment? What is the big catch? What is the pain point to Christian discipleship? We love comfort. And we have confused the comforts of this world with the comforts that Christ offers.
So this is kind of a follow-up to Brady's question. As individuals and as churches, what are some practical things that we can be doing in terms of sharing resources, or maybe leave it there.
Sure. What are the practical things that churches and congregations and Christian communities, say the groups of students on this campus? One of my favorite stories in the ethnography I did on this church in San Francisco called Redeemer Community Church was kind of in the ethnography learning the different stories of the church members. There was one student, or former student, that lived in the community. Her name is Chien. She was part of a family where all 4 of the kids went to Stanford University. And she describes an episode in her sophomore year, I believe. She describes Stanford as a place where you learn 2 things at once. One, that the world is going to, excuse my language, going to hell in a handbasket. And 2, that you're at Stanford to fix it. That you learn both of those simultaneously. She described the episode in which the realization of how troubled our world is, including the troubles of things like racial capitalism. She talked about how learning that just positively overwhelmed her. Especially the overwhelmment of being charged that because you are gifted in a certain kind of way, you're responsible for taking care of all of this. She talked about the overwhelmment of learning those 2 things so successively on a regular basis that she had what she described as a paralytic episode. She could not literally put one foot in front of the other. She dropped out of Stanford for the quarter, overwhelmed by what her education promised her and demanded of her. She ended up by friendship at Redeemer Community Church. And she said the way she was able to begin to put one foot in front of the other was being what she described as washed in the liturgy. Hearing the word of Christ preached over and over, read over and over in community, sitting in worship, being quiet, reading the Psalms, and the regular habituation into Christ's victory was the one thing that did 2 things for her. Helped her illuminate how bad, in fact, things are, far worse than they suggested at Stanford, because only when we see the goodness of Christ can we see how evil is. But she also was washed in what she described as hope. And the hope of a community of people that were, to her great surprise, just like her. Ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives. They would say that the reason they loved their neighbors and learned about the Bayview Hunters Point is they took one step at a time. Jesus called them to a neighborhood. They moved to the neighborhood. Jesus called them to the local schools. They raised their kids in local schools. Jesus showed them the great inequality of American public education. They protested that inequality. When Jesus came calling and said, what do you think about using your teacherly skills and brains and experience to start a school that might, in some tiny way, equal the playing field? They did that one step at a time. I imagine their faithfulness, right, is just like any of our faithfulness. You put one foot in front of the other, and you follow Jesus into a life 20 years down the road you could have never imagined. But 20 years in, you could never imagine without. My guess is in this community, in Greenville, especially in its proximity to places like Indianapolis, Chicago, St. Louis, you have evidence all around you for the ways that God is acting in the midst of extraordinary injustice. Learn those stories and begin to inhabit them, not as if they're stories of other people, but partly your own story, and see what it means to live into them. I mean, you look around the room, and it's got a lot of different kinds of folks in this room. What are the ways you can learn those stories, right? This is not about diversity training. Again, diversity training is generally a kind of hack, right, a kind of capitalist hack into forms of justice. But in most ways, it doesn't issue injustice. The question is, what are the ways you can learn to live that describe for you the full impacts of injustice, and what are the ways you can live into an alternative economy? Acts 2 gives us a wonderful picture of this, and it begins with forms of economic sharing.
Hey, first of all, I'm kind of fascinated by the statement of racism
persists
existing
because
it works, and just an idea of a pragmatic racism in our society. And I'm kind of wondering, with you talking about the divine economy and how, talking about an example of people moving into a community and building schools, starting businesses, can you talk about maybe the different results between the pragmatic racism that produces one specific result for a particular group of people, and then also the divine economy, which produces a different result? And I think you said that it was natural, so it was effective in a different way.
Right.
Can you talk about those two kind of different realities?
Yeah, this is a great question. So if you understand the kind of force of the arguments of the book, you should walk away from the book asking 2 really difficult questions. The first one is if race was concocted as a system of justification for exploitation and domination, what going forward should be the role of race? How should we think about ourselves racially? Should we? Let me be clear, I'm not coaching a kind of post-racialist fantasy or a kind of fantasy that we can imagine ourselves beyond the categories of race. But neither do I want us to double down on race as a way that essentializes one another. So the question going forward, one significant question from the book going forward is, what is the role of race in forms of liberation? That is a very difficult question, something we've been wrestling with in American culture for probably about 150 years. The other question is this question. If it is the case that capital needs ideological justification, but we still live in a capitalist society, and we have to acknowledge that capitalism is the greatest producer of wealth the world has ever seen, then how do we make our home within capitalism without being compromised by capitalism? Especially when Jesus had some very clear things to say about capital and about money. This is a very difficult question. One of the things I want to say is in the book, at the end of the book, I say there's some critical difference between Christian critical analysis, that is what we call sin, and the critical analysis that comes out of Marxism. The critical difference is this. Marxism is waiting for a revolution to start. Christianity lays claim to a revolution that is 2,000 years old. And the nature of that revolution is the church. Right? As our teacher often says, Stanley Hauerwas says, the church is not, say, an alternative viewpoint on politics. It isn't an alternative political position or platform. The church is an alternative politics. This gathered body around the one body is the beginning of political revolution, an entirely new way of being together. Part of that way of being together, as Acts 2 describes, is the radical sharing of material means and needs. The idea that my needs are yours and your wealth or your benefits are mine. That they're equally beneficial and equally afflicting. That radicality expressed in the baptism, remember, baptism names two things. One, your salvation, and two, your belonging to a corporate community. Right, our baptism, and then the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, where we say this body now belongs together in the one body Christ, that issues in a deep economy, a different kind of economy, a radical form of sharing. The difficulty is that you can't help but live out that economy within the broader economy in the earth, which is at this point global capitalism. And this is going to call for incredibly fine-tuned distinctions in what we're doing. Notice the company I talked about, Dayspring Partners, is a for-profit company. So on the face of it, it looks like any other company. But look at what it does with its money. It leans to a kind of tradition within Christianity, again, attested to in the New Testament church, radical forms of what we call redistribution. The taking of wealth and sharing it, believing that wealth is not something you own, so therefore you need to steward it. Rather, wealth is something about community. The Catholic Church has a very easy mantra for this. Whenever they think about wealth, the Catholic Church says, whenever you think about your own wealth, the mantra in the Catholic Church is, but there are poor people. That calibrates your wealth to always answer to not the people richer than you, but those brothers and sisters that are equally your brothers and sisters, partly as a function of having less than you. So it requires great discernment and wisdom how you start a Dayspring Partners without that company being appropriate to the capitalist economy versus, right? And one of the ways that Dayspring does this, and I describe this in the book, it's pretty amazing, is they have a board of advisors of principal leaders in the community. So it's like pastors, librarians, teachers that are the board of directors for their company. Any type of decision they make about how they spend their money has to go through that board. They've also committed that the wealth of the company will not be inherited by the starters of the company. Rather, the wealth within 5 years will be redistributed to the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood. They put in these practices, right, to make sure to check themselves so that they issue in these kind of finer-tuned discernments. I mean, these are the things that are, I almost want to say they're easy for Christianity. and yet we just haven't laid claim to them. They are the DNA of who we are. So I think I saw another question here. Okay. 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 We'll come back then. Other questions or thoughts?
I was just struck as you were talking. I was thinking about the verse, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it relates to it in Ephesians, where it says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." I assume that relates, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, that's one of the animating verses in the introduction to the book. What I try to do is give an account of the material forms of domination and exploitation, the Marxist analysis of how race is used as ideology to justify inequality, but then I bring in this verse that tells us those things are absolutely true, but they are not the entire truth of the matter. That at the end of the day, these are principalities and powers, what Paul calls principalities and powers, and what theologians throughout the history of the church have tried to describe as what looks like simply material realities, as realities that kind of exist in the air of creation. And I use kind of early patristic theology to describe evil as a turning in of goodness, right? What Augustine, the Eastern Fathers as well, talked about in terms of what evil always is the detachment from the source of our life, God, and the seeking in our own life to sustain and nurture ourselves. And eventually, this evil becomes radical insofar as it begins to implode in itself. It needs more radically to nourish itself, but it can't. And in doing so, it becomes increasingly violent. If you look at, say, the history of chattel slavery, nothing in my mind can explain that except for the Christian account of sin. I was talking to Ben about this earlier today. As I mentioned earlier, I was raised non-Christian, but one of the things that intellectually impressed me most about Christianity when I first began to examine it is the incredibly sophisticated moral psychology. It is able to describe that verse in the clever ways it works itself out in our life. Something like in the highfalutin realities of racial capitalism and in our need to justify ourselves, right? We are creatures who don't simply sin, but in sinning, still incline towards the good enough to feel like we need to explain ourselves, even if the explanation is duplicitous and self-deceived. I mean, that is an extraordinary moral psychology. And one of the problems we were talking about with a lot of the anti-racism on offer in the popular culture is that rather than taking a sophisticated account of how clever we are, it divides the world neatly between the good and the evil, right? And it's often raced in that distinction. Rather, we need very, very sophisticated accounts to make sense of very, very sophisticated realities. So certainly that verse has been a mantra for me in terms of thinking through these questions.
All right, so my question is, what role does the church play in racial capitalism?
Do you mean in contributing to its evil,
Yes,
or do you mean fighting
contributing
against
its
it?
evil.
Contributing to its evil?
To racial capitalism.
This is a great question. So in the book, I do two things. In the second half, I tell the story of Redeemer, and I try to tell the story of Redeemer in relationship to the history of Bayview Hunters Point, which is, again, an amazing history. I mean, just check out the history of environmental racism in the Bayview Hunters Point, and the way that very interesting figures show up, like the Japanese and the Japanese internment and these kinds of things. In the first half of the book, I try to give an account of racial capitalism, specifically as a church practice. So let me step back and return to the comment I just made about the kind of simplistic anti-racism we have in our culture. In the same way we want to borrow the kind of the orthodox account of racism that is convenient, we also want to imagine racists conveniently, right? We think racism are those white dudes who have the white sheets, the Klan outfit hidden under their bed, and they pull it out every once in a while and then go burn some crosses. It's always someone out there. And it's not to say that the Klan or the lynching they did wasn't absolute evil, but again, that is, in a sense, a redundant part of the entire process of exploitation and domination. So what I try to do in the first half of the book is give a very historical, material explanation of how most often racism works. And it isn't the Klan. It isn't the person that dons the white sheets. It's rather someone like me, someone like a lot of us in this room, someone that benefits from systems of disadvantage. The story I tell is about, and then I'll get to the part about the church in a second. The story I tell is about Chinese migrants who were brought to the South right after Reconstruction. That is, right, the U.S. economy had been built on the backs of slaves, literally built on the backs of slaves. And it was on the backs of slaves during a period in American history called Second Slavery, from the 19th century to the Civil War, that the U.S. economy became the world's most dominant economy vis-a-vis King Cotton. And remember, it wasn't simply an enterprise of the South. The North was entirely up in financing this, just like it was entirely up, the British government was entirely up in creating this. There was a triangle that Du Bois calls the triangle between Mississippi, Manhattan, and Manchester. So even those who had washed their hands of slavery, the North and England, were entirely complicit in this process. Well, that economy needed cheap labor after emancipation. And where were they going to get it? Well, they tried all kinds of things, the Southern planters. They tried to import labor from the North. They tried to bring Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, but eventually they landed on Chinese because Chinese had been exploited since their coming to America in the 17th, 18th century. That's what we call coolies, right? Well, they thought that they could replace enslaved black people with indentured Chinese people, and the Chinese people came to Mississippi. They quickly realized what was happening, and they refused the terms, but they were stuck in the South. And so what they did is they created these companies, or these businesses, literal markets. And what the markets did is live between the white world and the black world, because the white people wouldn't let them live with them and wouldn't let them start businesses in their communities. And the black folks were disenfranchised from the local businesses. So what the Chinese did is exploit a market opportunity that made them over generations simultaneously, and this is where your question comes into play, simultaneously the wealthiest Asian Americans in the country and the most Christian. The question is, what did the church do? Because these Asian people became Christians because what did the Southern Baptist churches realize? We don't need to send missionaries to China. They've come into our backyard. So they Christianized these folks, made them Christians. And how did the capitalism work in those churches, getting to the heart of your question? It never said anything that there was a problem with what they were doing. They said it was a problem for you Chinese people to get drunk. It's a problem for you to gamble. But there is absolutely no problem for you to participate in a racial capitalist economy that exploits your neighbors. There's no problem with wealth. These were churches that were known for fire and brimstone gospel preaching, you know, the kind of stereotypes we have of the South. But they said nary a word about the problems of capitalism, about wealth, accumulation, and exploitation. They took it for granted that God was in it for the wealth. And therefore, it was fine for Christians to do so. It's the same thing we see today, right? We rarely hear churches preach on this. I don't. My pastor constantly preaches on this. But most churches don't touch this because they realize messing with these questions spells doom for your church. So that's the nature. It was not the Klan evil, dripping with hatred. It wasn't the sheriff unleashing his attack dogs on the civil rights workers at the counter. It rather looks like us. What does it look like today? Visit East Waco. Visit Southwest Waco. And notice how one absolutely relies on the other. And the way that people in Southwest Waco just presume that they have wealth and access because they deserve it, and those people don't. That's participation. That's how it works. None of those people, as far as I know, have Klan sheets underneath their bed, but they're absolutely neck deep in racial capitalism. This is the question for our age, and how we begin to call the church to do something different, which, in my mind, going back to the question about the Bible verse, is simply to call us to what we began with when Jesus talked about these things in terms of the money, and that Paul talked about in terms of principalities and powers. So. Any other questions? Thoughts? How you've seen these things?
I was grow up like you. I was not grow up I grew up in China, so I'm not grow up by Christian culture. So I become baptized in 2018, like 6 years ago. So and then when I first come to the United States and I heard your story talking about, I was totally like, I feel, but not that strong. When you mention about, I feel like, wow, that's really opened my mind to know about this kind of racial capitalism, right? So me, I'm still Asian, right? What do you want me as an Asian educator to do in our future teaching? What do you want me to do? So what I can do for this?
Well, I'll presume you'll do way better than I did. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the black intellectual tradition, the black Marxist analysis that I've borrowed from here, is how internationalist it is. It tries to track analogies with what's happened in America to what's happened in, say, the Caribbean, to what's happened in Africa, to what's currently happening in China, right? So if you look at, for example, in the, say, 3-4 years ago, the Uyghurs were often in our news, right? That is what the Chinese were doing to Western region Chinese folks. And it bordered on what most of us describe as a kind of genocidal experiment with these populations. Well, if you look at the ideology that the Chinese government used to peddle what they're doing, it was all kinds of strange metaphysical claims about Confucianism, and it worked. Oftentimes when you surveyed or interviewed the rank and file Chinese person, they agreed with what their government was doing. It looked like what they're doing was driven by what these ideologies suggested. However, drilled down, and what you realize why the genocidal experiments in the Uyghur region was necessary was because the government was expanding its economy west, and the Uyghurs stood in the way. It's the same thing that's happening everywhere in the world. So part of the benefit for this kind of analysis is the way it draws analogies with allies who are being oppressed all over the world. And it imagines the story in America as not simply a narrow American story, but a story about the universality, even say the Catholicity of sin and the powers and principalities. And if we can begin then to see allies in different places, oppressed in different kinds but common ways, then we can begin to imagine forms of revolution. This is most powerfully articulated in the 19th century sociologist Oliver Cromwell Cox. He wrote a magnificent big book called Race, Caste, and Class, in which he talks about the oppression of Chinese migrants, the oppression of poor whites, and the oppression of black folks as all different but related. And he said only by understanding these lines of connection across multiple locales across the globe do we begin to get a full handle of what we're up against.